Context windows have come up a lot today in the news, and you've probably heard a little bit about it, but if you're not super familiar with LLMs, it's super helpful to understand what does like a context mean and like why is it so important and why are these models like counting the size of their context windows. Let's jump into it and I'll explain it to you. So a context window, you can kind of think about it as almost like the short-term memory of a large language model. And to put it into kind of like a real world scenario, imagine you're reading a book, but at any point in time, you can only reference and only understand what is said on a given page, which means that you kind of forget all the pages before it, and you don't have any access to all the pages that are in front of it. This is your context window. And context windows are super important because that's what allows these large language models to create like coherent and contextualized responses. So if you've ever been chatting with ChatGPT and you see it reference things back that you had said before or mentioned and it kind of seems superhuman, it's because what it's doing is pulling out of its context window things that were said. And again, you can almost think of like a context window as RAM in a computer, right? Like it can only hold so much in this temporary memory storage. And context windows are important because as you have lengthy discussions or cram a bunch of information into a large language model, that context window shifts forward and backwards, right? So you could look at this timeline here, but imagine you've had like a really lengthy conversation with a large language model like ChatGPT or Claude or some other one, and that context window will shift. And so if you do it long enough, you'll see it'll start to forget things that came at the beginning of the conversation. Because as it adds in new information, it has to get rid of something. Like it is a finite amount of memory, a finite amount of data these models can reference at any point in time. And that means that the problems that they can solve and the amount of text that they can coherently generate is limited as well. And you might be thinking, well, like, why don't we we've got tons of compute and of really large amounts of RAM and computers out there. I've got a solution. Let's just make the context window infinite. Like, why do we have to limit it to a certain amount of size? And this is where a really interesting problem comes in. And it's called the context window paradox. And so the context window paradox is basically this really interesting byproduct that happens when, as you start to grow these context window sizes, it almost starts to degrade the performance of the LLM, meaning that it kind of is no longer able to understand what is important or relevant, right? So we've kind of hit these, not theoretical maximums, but we've hit this sweet spot in these context windows where the text that the LLM will generate seems magical, seems really coherent, seems to able to pull from what was being said before and reference back in ways that is very, very intuitive and very, very positive. But what we've seen is that as we just start to wildly expand these context windows, it starts to kind of give out gibberish. And all of a sudden it starts to kind of lose its train of thought almost. And a lot of the models out there, you've probably seen this, taunting, kind of touting what their context window sizes are. And this, at the time of writing, right, is kind of some of the context sizes with the number of words from the developers they come from. I think this is actually wrong here. I think Gemini 1.5 Pro is actually 1.5 million tokens. But for like a given frame of reference, to GPT-4, as of today, is around 8,000 tokens or about 6,000 words, which means that any point in time, GPT-4 can only reference, that local kind of segmented, remember against the timeline, only about 6,000 words. So if you have a 10,000 word conversation, those first 4,000 words, it's not going to remember. It's only going to remember that back 6,000 words. And for us, this is a really, really interesting problem to solve because Crowdbotics here, we're interested in using large language models to understand and write code. And code is a lot of tokens, right? So, like on average, let's say that an enterprise code base is about 1 million lines of code with about 50 characters per line. That's 50 million characters or about 12.5 million tokens. So you can see that we've got 12.5 million that we need it to understand all of those, but we can only handle about 8,000 at a time, or in some of the best cases, maybe 1.5 million, we're still significantly orders of magnitude off. And this has been a really, really fun problem to work on and something that we have a pretty unique solution to do in this. So if you want to learn more about that, I'm not going to go into it today. Please reach out. We would love to chat on how we have done that and probably reveal some of those secrets in a future video. But that in and of itself is the context window paradox. And there's tons of good research and white papers and things you can go look to learn more. But I hope that if you watch this to this point, you now kind of understand why context windows are so important and why a lot of these model providers are actually kind of using it in their marketing material all over the place. But until next time, check out some of these other videos, and we'll see you in the next one.